A Notable Ruin, Louisbourg. A paper read before the Nova Scotia Historical Society, November 10, 1908, by J.S. McLennan. Published by the Nova Scotia Historical Society, 1909. The history of the town of Louisbourg is not my subject. Parkman's 2 chapters about the sieges have omitted nothing essential or picturesque in this description of these events. No historian of Europe who treats of the middle of the 18th century, wherein the colonial empire of the world passed from France to Britain, omits its name, and the archives of this society have been enriched with the results. Careful, scholarly, and engrossing research by its members. While these do not exhaust the material available, the subject of this paper is the topography of the place, to put before you as clearly as may be what remains of the town and fortress, what may be traced of those operations of defense and attack which bring the story of Louisbourg into the current of world history, and make it of particular moment to the history of Canada, of French colonization, of military science. Let us at the outset look far back into history. We find that what longest survives is the thing which people, men of passions like to our own, keen about the same things as we are, made for beauty. The wealth, the learning, the laws, the social structure of Assyria are gone, but alone of all Assyrians did, today exists the sculpture wrought by her artists to adorn the temples and palaces, a delight and an inspiration to the sculpture of today. Change the name and the sentence stands equally true for Egypt. Coming to later times, Greece has left a heritage which is richer. Her literature, her philosophy, are still potent influences, but it may be maintained that the artist follows more directly the examples of Praxiteles than the modern thinker, the philosophy of Plato. Next to these things, the flowering of old civilizations in material which has endured the vicissitudes of time, survives the memory of places where great events happened. Carthage and Troy are ancient and enduring names which overshadow in importance anything saved from their sites. Waterloo was an obscure Belgian hamlet until Napoleon and Wellington met there. There are scores of places in Europe known to all on account of their past, while their contemporary importance is so little that they merit mention only in a local guidebook. What is there in its history to bring Louisbourg into the same rank as those places? We cannot dwell on its history as a colony, for that is as dead as the tradings of Phoenicia. But 2 events happened which make it important. First, the capture by New England colonists in 1745. Secondly, the capture in 1758. The first, so to speak, the result of an impulse. The second, one of the important events of the Great 7 Years' War, fought in India, America, and in Europe. The direct result of the first was ephemeral. The Treaty of Peace, which concluded the war, restored Louisbourg and its dependencies to France. But the indirect results were more enduring. For the first time, the militia of New England engaged in regular warfare. A siege, I take it, is the most conventional of all military operations. Their opponents were trained soldiers, defending a fortress vastly more important and stronger than anything held in America by the British Crown. While many of them knew its weakness, for the New England trader was far more familiar with Louisbourg than with any other place outside New England, it was, by his standards, a strong place. So when the gunners of New England, untrained except as privateersmen, its militia, unused to anything but irregular warfare, light-heartedly took Louisbourg in 1745 as promptly and efficiently as did the great expedition of 1758, it heightened in the colonist a sense of his own importance, which, it may be, is never entirely wanting in the colonial Britain. And it does not seem unreasonable to believe that his victory over the French troops at Louisbourg no less than his comparison of himself in American warfare with the regulars of the British Army, gave him heart when a generation later he took up arms against the mother country. The cession of Louisbourg by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle struck hard at colonial interests, and no one likes to sacrifice particular good for the benefit of the body politic. The irritation it produced was great and widespread, and in the colonists kept alive a desire for its recapture, which made them eager for the renewal of hostilities. The sense that the betrayal of their interest, heightened by the fact that it was the spoils of their prowess which were given back, was not straightening to the bonds which held the colonies to the crown. The second capture is what brings Louisbourg into the forefront. It was a strongly fortified port placed where it commanded the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the single entrance to the vast colonies of Canada. So Louisbourg, in the possession of France, as a base for a French fleet in North Atlantic, and Canada was safe indefinitely. Louisbourg in British hands, and it was only a question of time when Canada must fall. What this meant we can only realize by looking at the map. Britain held from Maine to Georgia, with Acadia and Newfoundland. The rest of the continent to the Rockies was French, with the exception of Hudson's Bay. The key to this vast treasure house was Louisbourg. When the grapple came, it was the first place to be attacked. Its cession settled the matter. The opinion of the civilian on military strategy should perchance not be uttered, but my reading of the significance of these events is that on that eventful morning of the spring of 1760, when the British inside Quebec, the French encamped over against it, watched with the last degree of eagerness the first ship to arrive from sea, break out her flag, both French and English conscious of the momentous import of the event. Had the Laustaf proved to be a French frigate, forerunner of the fleet, Quebec would have again been French, but Louisbourg being British, the triumph would have been temporary, and its recapture by de Lévis as impotent to alter the main course of events as Montcalm's victories in 1758. The supremacy of sea power is illustrated in those campaigns. Old as the Greeks, restated admirably in our times by Captain Mahan, it is amply illustrated by the events of the 7 Years' War. To no other living people should it appeal more keenly than to the overseas citizens of the empire to which we belong. To the supremacy of the sea power in the hands of England, at this epoch, is owing the fall of the French colonial empire. It was a period when France's naval power was at its lowest, but low as it was, its destruction in these waters by the capture of Louisbourg, its base, was a great feat of arms. It should not pass unnoticed that no less a person than Washington said that without the assistance of the French fleet in the American Revolution, the colonies would not have achieved their independence. From the standpoint of the impartial historian, a fine evening up to France for the loss of Canada in the previous war. The exposition of this theme is attractive in more respects than as a contribution to the history of military tactics. The soundness of the British policy of strengthening her navy, the evil consequences to France of allowing hers to become weak, are proved by the events which took place on these coasts. Events which brought out such gallant actions, both French and English, that it is with regret we find them without the bounds set for this paper. Louisbourg, the naval base which made Canada secure, which threatened the British colonies, is situated not far from the southeast point of the island of Cape Breton, just beyond the Bay of Gabarus. Along the northern shore of that bay there rises from the water a stretch of moor and marsh, in places open, in others covered with scrubby trees, and this ends in a low point which forms the southwest side of Louisbourg harbor. Inland from this plain are higher hills, which follow at a short distance from the shore the windings of the sea-coast and of the port. As the plain falls from them to the shore, It is broken in several places by hillocks which command the uniformly level point. The French military engineers took advantage of 3 of these hillocks, the middle being the highest, and utilized them in laying out their work and extended from harbor to sea a line of works, the highest hill crowned by the citadel, or King's Bastion, which contained the governor's house, the chapel, and the barracks. The principal gate of the town was close by the waters of the harbor, and was defended by a spur and demi-bastion, the former of which had guns which swept the harbor. This was known as Dauphin Gate and Bastion. Beyond the citadel on the seaside was the Queen's Bastion, an important work which was strengthened by a demi-lune after the return of the place to France in 1749, and at the seashore a demi-bastion Princess, from which a wall extended along the inaccessible shore to the eastward works, which consisted of 2 demi-bastions. A battery was placed on the shore of the harbor, and from it extended a wall, which shut in the harbor side of the town. These works encircling the town were built on the approved system of Vauban. The outermost was the smooth turf of the glacis, which rose from the moor to the edge of the parapet, 4 feet above the narrow banquette, on which infantry could stand in shelter and sweep with musketry the slopes of the glacis and the ground beyond. Below the banquette was the covered way, 20 feet in width, on which troops could assemble and maneuver, and within this was the ditch 80 feet wide, from which rose the wall from 30 to 36 feet high, crowned with a rampart, within which was a banquette and open space for the cannon, which fired through embrasures in the parapet. Distributed along these works, but for the most part in the bastions, were 123 cannon, of which 69 were 24 pounds, and 29 of 42 pounds. That is heavy guns. But Louisbourg did not depend entirely on the artillery on its walls. On the extremity of Point Rochefort was a battery of 17 guns. On the island beyond, commanding the narrow entrance to the harbor, was a battery of 39 guns, and facing the entrance to the harbor was the Royal Battery, which, as it was commanded by the hills above, was dismantled by the French and not used during the siege of 1758. In 1745, it was abandoned by the French, taken possession of by Pepperell's forces, and its gun turned with effect against the town. The length of the western fortifications was about 1,000 yards, and from their interior to the eastern bastions about a quarter of a mile, which was the length of their longest streets. These were narrow, only 24 feet wide, the houses mostly of wood. So with fisheries, the principal industry, it could have never been entirely satisfactory to fastidious senses, but it must have been picturesque. Here, soldiers in white uniforms, naval cadets in scarlet and gold, officers from the ships in blue, met with the fishermen, the townspeople, the monks, and the missionaries, and among them the traders from New England. There would have been in the harbor 2 or 3 scores of French fishing vessels, men of war, models to all countries of the best in naval architecture, French East Indiamen, which had brought thus far their precious cargoes and lay at anchor refitting for the last stage of their voyage from the Pacific, and among them the coasters of the country and New England. On the windswept point, broken by the mounds of the old works, it is as difficult to picture the town, sheltered by its walls, surmounted by its citadel, crowned by its lofty buildings, as looking over its empty harbor, to see the fleets which for 40 years crowded its waters. A few words of history are perhaps necessary to make clear the narrative. Newfoundland, Hudson's Bay Territory, and Acadia were ceded to Britain by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. And that France might retain a foothold on these coasts, from which to prosecute the fisheries, the islands of Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island were acknowledged hers. Cape Breton was settled, Louisbourg fortified, and France shared in what was then the greatest source of American wealth, the fisheries of these waters. So great was it that in the middle of the century, its annual value was estimated as worth to France about £950,000. From 1713 to 1744 was, with one exception, the longest peace between France and England in 2 centuries. And the new colony made progress. The fortifications were laid out and built, beginning in 1718, and being practically finished about 1735. With many vicissitudes, the colony grew and its trade extended. Primarily, it was commercial in its object. Its military importance was belittled by the authorities, its trading success fostered, the object of the French being to control the fisheries, the object of the New England merchants to secure them all for themselves. So when war broke out in 1744, and the governor of Louisbourg irritated the New Englanders by the capture of their little settlement at Canso, and by a feeble attack on Annapolis, while privateers of both colonies preyed on each other's commerce, the temper of Massachusetts rose to a point that it finally, through its assembly, acquiesced in its governor's proposal to send an expedition against Louisbourg. Gathered in a few weeks, the force of under 4,000 men, under the command of Pepperrell, established a base at Canso where Commodore Warren, commanding on this station, joined them with his squadron. They arrived on April 30th in Gabarus Bay, before a town and garrison which had made no preparations for defense, landed without opposition, established one by one their batteries, nearer and nearer the walls, until on June 16th, breaches had been made through which the town could be stormed, the order of attack for the ships had been arranged, and the place being no longer tenable, was surrendered to Pepperrell and Warren. England heard the astounding news of the feat of her colonial subjects. A fortress and its garrison of 650 troops and 1,310 militia surrendered to the colonial militiamen. Making allowance for the smallness of the garrison and the fact that it was distinctly on the defensive, so that the New Englanders had not to stand attack, and the fine weather, it remains a remarkable instance of what intelligent and willing men can accomplish under favorable conditions. Louisbourg was held first by the colonists, much against their will, and then by a regular garrison until the end of the war, and was restored to France by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. It was evacuated and repossession taken by the French in 1749, but it was a better Louisbourg which they received. Much work had been done. The fortifications were strengthened and new barracks built, while in the parade ground of the citadel, bomb-proofs were built which can still be seen. Conditions made the peace of 1748 little more than a truce. While it lasted, Louisbourg was strengthened and its garrison increased. When, as a consequence of colonial friction and European complications, war broke out, Louisbourg, escaping attack in 1757, was besieged the following year. The expedition, under Boscawen and Amherst, using Halifax as its base, sailed thence and appeared in Gabarus Bay on the 2nd of June. The naval force consisted of 23 men of war, mounting 1,544 guns, 67 frigates, and the land forces and munitions of war employed 144 transports. The land forces were close on 12,000 men. The expedition was amply supplied with materials for a siege. They brought 140 pieces of artillery, about 90,000 shot and shell, and 4,900 barrels of powder. The amplitude of the supply is indicated by the fact that there were used only about 1,500 barrels of powder and about 14,000 shot. To oppose this attacking force, there were in the harbor of Louisbourg 12 men of war mounting 556 guns, of which only one escaped, and the captured garrison, consisting of 3,031 men, and the crews of the ships, who served on shore, numbered 2,606, besides an uncertain but not large number of militia. Bad weather delayed the landing, which was opposed until the 8th of June. It was not until the 19th that the first battery opened fire, and the siege went on until on the 26th of July the town surrendered. The second siege took practically the same length of time, with the same proportion in numbers as the siege of 1745. The desire of Pitt was the annihilation of French sea power, for with it must fall her colonial empire and end the wealth she drew from the Atlantic fisheries. The maintenance of a base in America, where ships might refit, from which protective or offensive operations might be conducted, was essential, and Halifax having been established, it was sound military reasoning which led to his orders to demolish Louisbourg and to make its harbor useless. Considerations of expense and time modified his projects, but the demolition of the fortifications was completed in 1760. There had been possibilities of peace throughout all but the earliest years of the war, but to American colonists, at all events, the destruction of Louisbourg gave satisfaction. For if again British diplomacy yielded what British arms had won, that which would be returned would be ruins and not a fortress of enhanced value. Enough remains on the ground, notwithstanding the demolition and the effects of time, to make it possible, by using the documents which exist, to reconstruct the city as it was. The French were admirable mapmakers, and their centralized administration made necessary constant reports with plans attached, which show all the stages of such work as the fortification of Louisbourg. These are available to the student in the repositories of Paris, where, for example, in one collection are nearly 100 plans of the town and works of Louisbourg. There are many others in other collections. Fortunately for the historian, Sieur Lartigue, king's storekeeper at Louisbourg, was an amateur engineer of no mean skill, and probably after the cession of the place, he beguiled the tedium of waiting for deportation to France by drawing a very complete plan of the English operations in 1758. An unknown hand has been equally explicit for the operations of 1745. With these guides, one can find on the ground traces of the batteries which the besiegers erected, the site of the camp along Freshwater Brook, which was used by Pepperrell and Amherst. Below the ruins of the lighthouse, the first erected on these coasts, can be traced the outlines of the battery from which first Gridley, and in 58 Wolfe, silenced the island battery and made open the way into the harbor for the blockading fleets. On the eastern ridge, which overlooks Coromandel Cove, one may stand and see the outlines of the earthworks, from which by so decisive a repulse St. Julien drove back the eager forces of Wolfe before they landed, that they were spared falling in a slaughter like that of Ticonderoga, so strong were the defenses of the French. Looking down from the same slope, one may search for the little space of sand, but 12 or 14 yards in extent, surrounded by rocks, where 3 young officers and their men, after Wolfe had given the signal to retreat, made good a landing and retrieved for him the success which his gallant direct attack had not achieved. On the shores of the harbor, above the brook which runs into the Barachois, are the foundations of the battery erected with the special object of driving away from her moorings the little frigate Artuse, her skillful and incessant fire having impeded the advance of the siege batteries. The position being no longer tenable, Vauquelin, her captain, made so fine a sortie through the blockading fleet that, after the capture, Boscawen asked who he was, and being told, said that if one of his junior captains had done as well, his first care on his return to England would be to ask for him the command of a ship of the line. So gallantly did the same Vauquelin fight his ship at Quebec, that the British put a vessel at his disposal with orders to land him at the French port he might select. Coming to the town itself, the demolition of the fortifications has obliterated the exact lines of the different parts of the defensive works. The glacis and ditch are distinct. Foundations of the buildings of the citadel are to be seen, and the buildings in best preservation are casemates on either side of the parade ground erected during the British occupancy. But guided by a map, all the works can be positively identified. So it is with the buildings of the town. The streets are easily traced. Not only are their names known, but it is possible to give the owners of most of the dwellings, who were mostly officers of the troops and civil officials, while among the waterfront were some official buildings and the establishments of the more important merchants. A little way back from the quay stood the parish church of Our Lady of the Angels, before its altar was buried by Duc d'Anville, peer of France, admiral of her navy, who commanded that great armada which sailed in 1746 to recapture Louisbourg. Tempest and plague followed the mighty fleet to Chebucto, where d'Anville died, overwhelmed by disaster. When Louisbourg was returned to France, the Grand Saint-Esprit brought back to French soil his remains, and Desherbier, the governor, records the place of his burial. This should be easily identified. The burial place at Point Rochefort is known. The ruins of the hospital stand up, and it is probable that a little excavation might reveal some of the elaborate ornamentation of the town gates. In short, what I have seen of the site and of the documents, I feel certain that the complete reconstruction of the place is only a question of intelligence and outlay. Is it not fitting that these things should be preserved? They are now exposed to all the hazards of private ownership. The future historian, the Canadian of later generations visiting the places where his country was made, has a right to expect from his forerunners the preservation for them of what the past has handed on to us. It was the lot of the men of 5 generations ago to do epoch-making deeds. Ours is the humble task to preserve the memorials of them. Our discharge of that duty will make it more easy. It may be for our successors to rise to emergencies which may try their powers. The preservation of historic sites is too large a task for private or corporate undertaking. Indeed, part of its significance would be lost were it not the action of the people through their governments. They should acquire the land, defray the cost of removing all that obliterates or disfigures ancient remains, and give an annual grant to maintain the grounds. The most efficient way would be through a commission. For such work, if ill done, is worse than neglect. The posts of the besiegers should be marked, as well as the defenses, the principal buildings, and the streets. Here and there should be tablets, one to the exploit and landing of Brown, Hopkins, and Grant, another to Vauquelin, a third to Madame Drucourt, wife of the governor, who daily passed along the fire-swept ramparts to encourage the gunners. Plans exist for the house of the intendant. It is suitably placed, and as it is typically French of the epoch, it would make an admirable museum. Therein should be a collection of relics from the ruins, of maps and plans, a nucleus for such a collection existing. Possibly, if such a museum were solidly established, Harvard College might return to it the cross from the church carried to New England after 1745, and fortunately preserved by that institution. But, however, worked out in detail, there is necessity for taking prompt action. You in Halifax are working along sound lines in the memorial to the first meeting of a representative assembly within the empire outside the British Isles. Within 3 months from his services as brigadier at Louisbourg, Lawrence, as Captain General of Nova Scotia, summoned its first assembly. There is more than this personal connection between these two events. The capture of that fortress and its sequences made the soil of Canada British. The representative assembly, which met in Halifax, 19 men, not all of British stock, led to its people becoming masters of their own destinies. A handful of people in Nova Scotia, a conquered colony, alien in language and allegiance along the St. Lawrence and the vast territory of unknown land, which stretched in solitary spaces to the Pacific. Such was Canada at the end of the struggle with France. In the years which have passed since then, the colony existing for the commercial benefit of the mother country has risen to the status of a self-governing state of an empire wherein the descendants of both parties to the old struggle are fellow citizens, charged with a common task. Let us not forget that it was no difference in valor, in self-sacrifice, in intelligence which determined the result of that conflict. Its outcome was inherent in those causes which led one people to attain self-government, the other to be subjects of an absolute monarchy. Therefore, while you carry to completion your commemoration of the principle which shapes the destinies of peoples to become greater than any of us foresee, lend your aid to preserve, before preservation becomes more difficult, the site where events occurred which made possible, over the whole of North America, self-government and all it means to mankind. On the 9th of September, 1713, a little group of Frenchmen who founded Louisbourg took possession of Cape Breton in the name of the most Christian king. Nearly 2 centuries have gone by since then, but the anniversary of that day would be a most fitting time to mark the completion of an effort to preserve the memory of that colony with all that its fortunes have signified to France, to Britain, to America. The responsibility for this rests on our society, on Nova Scotia, on Canada, and the view that the initiative should be taken by this society is one which I trust will commend itself to its members.